All right, hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. My name is Thomas, and this channel is dedicated toward educational matters. And today is video 126 on the reciprocal system of theory, which is a obscure, pretty unknown theory from the 20th century that was devised by Dewey B. Larson. He died back in 1990, but not before he published um, mostly self-published, about 15 books and many, many articles on the reciprocal system. The reciprocal system is a theory of everything, meaning that you can, it's a system. If you understand the system, then you can plug it into any subject that you want. And you can do it yourself. You don't have to rely on somebody else to do it for you. And you can check things yourself. It has a lot of implicit checks in it, meaning that if you understand how it works, then you can check it and check other theories with the reciprocal system as well. Now, the basic idea is that we live in a universe of motion. Not a universe of matter, not a universe of energy, but a universe of motion. Matter and energy are just actually specific kinds of motion, as are all the other different scientific phenomena, such as pressure and electric current, electric charge, magnetic flux, acceleration, force, gravity, mass, energy. All those things are different kinds of motion. And for Larson, motion is the relationship between space and time. So space and time are the two components of motion, and they go together in a fraction. And that fraction can be 1, 2, or 3 or more dimensions. And time and space are both in discrete units. They are not continuous. They don't have micro, units. Their individual units are very small, but they basically come in chunks, 1 unit at a time. And again, they both have 3 or more dimensions. We see that in space as coordinate space, X, Y, Z dimensions. And that also occurs in time. That's called coordinate time. And space is also progressing or flowing, just like time is. Time is always getting later and later. Space, too, is always getting farther and farther and farther apart. And the analogy you would use for that clock time or clock space is a balloon that you put a bunch of dots on with a magic marker. You blow up the balloon and all the dots are moving away from each other in no particular direction or in all directions at once. And that is called a scalar outward motion. Then if you suck in the balloon, all of the dots are moving toward each other. The closer they are together, or the further away they are, the faster they're moving toward each other. And that is called a scalar motion, inward scalar motion. And so that's kind of where Larson starts from. We are getting toward the end of an interview that he did back in 1984 with a guy named John Sommer, and it just goes into the various things that were at stake during the time when Larson was putting together his theory, what he was thinking about, what his intentions were, where he wants the theory to go. Now he's deceased, and so we have to take over that responsibility. But he left us in pretty good hands, and especially some of his successors, such as the late Bruce Perret, along with KVK Nehru and Gopi Krishna, have led the theory in very productive ways. And it's not wrapped up tight, but it there's a lot of leads to go on, and a lot of areas that the theory can be led. And again, each one of us has the opportunity to take this theory wherever we want to take it once we understand the system itself. Okay, so I'm going to take over here in this interview with the first question by Samer. How are you able to venture into these different fields and zero in on the fundamental flaw in each one? Do you follow a general method in your approach? Larson, what I have seen is that the fundamentals of the different fields of thought are rather closely connected. And it's been my observation that the great deal of trouble that the different branches of thought are having right now is that they're not taking advantage of advances that have been made in other fields. For instance, in most branches of thought, they recognize what they call the law of diminishing returns, which simply says that the ratio of the input into a physical process to an output does not remain constant. It decreases and eventually goes to zero. Well, that's very important in economics, and they recognize that. But it's just as important in science, but they don't recognize it. That's the problem we're having now with Einstein saying that nothing can go faster than the speed of light. It wouldn't be bothering us if they were to recognize the law of diminishing returns, because what he is doing is taking Newton's second law, the force is equal to the mass times acceleration, and assuming that that carries on into infinity, which it doesn't. It's subject to the law of diminishing returns, just the same as anything else. And if he had recognized that, he wouldn't have arrived at that conclusion that nothing can move any faster. But then we have a situation on the opposite side. In the physical science, they lay a great deal of stress on equilibrium. And the laws of equilibrium are regarded as very important in science. And they're just as important in economics. In fact, they're the key to a lot of economic problems, but they don't recognize it at all and don't pay any attention to them. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about in the matter of general principles. I am interested in the principles themselves rather than in the narrow line. I'm not talking about equilibria in science. I'm talking about them as a general principle. Okay, just a parenthetical. I didn't mention that, when you have discrete time and space, 1 unit of time, 1 unit of space in 1 unit of time is the speed of light. So for Larson, the speed of light is 1, and it's basically the origin. And that makes sense as he has posited a universe of motion. So motion is really the origin, the groundwork, the datum, the zero datum, the null point or the neutral point of the universe, and that so that there's an entire half of the universe that's moving faster than the speed of light, whereas Einstein says that the speed of light is the maximum speed of the universe. So that's a huge difference in those two different theories. And he's showing how Einstein wouldn't have gotten that wrong had he understood the principle of diminishing returns. Okay, now back to the questioner. Is that the reason you said earlier that you wouldn't classify yourself as a scientist? Is that too narrow a definition? Larson, well, if I had to classify myself, on the other hand, if somebody says, well, you write this book, are you a scientist? Well, I say that's a matter of definition. The definition that I would use, the definition of a scientist, I can say that I'm a scientist, but on the basis of the same definition, I can say that I'm an economist, possibly a philosopher. So I say that if it were possible, I'd like to describe myself as a fundamentalist, but somebody else has preempted that. Question. One of the main difficulties people tend to have in approaching the theory for the first time is the extra dimensions that cannot be represented in the reference system. How would one begin to visualize these extra dimensions? Larson. Those things were difficult for me to grasp in the first place. Then the question of expressing it to someone else is even worse. Generally speaking, as far as I'm concerned, the understanding comes kind of gradually. And of course, we have a number of such things. In fact, the portion of the universe that can be represented in our reference system is smaller than the portion that can't be. We don't have to worry particularly about the cosmic sector, the other half, because we have no access to it anyway, and we have nothing of it in this way, and we have knowledge of it in this way, that whenever we learn something in our own material sector, we know the same thing holds in the reverse over there. Okay, now what he's really saying is like the speed of light is the midpoint of the universe. Half the universe is moving faster than the speed of light, therefore. Half is moving slower. And the half that's moving slower, we're familiar with that half. That is what he calls the material sector, or sector one. The half that's moving faster, we are not familiar with it, or as familiar with it. And this is what he calls the cosmic sector, or sector two. And this is kind of the bridge to the metaphysical, but it is definitely starting with the control unit, and also life. Life phenomena come from the cosmic sector, and so does intelligence. And so he's saying that we don't really have access to the cosmic sector, sector two, but what we know about sector one is exactly the same as what's going on in sector two, except that you have to invert the roles of time and space. So what's going on here is generally a space over time relationship. And what's going on over here is exactly the same, but it's basically a time over space relationship. And that's what he says. We know that the same thing holds in reverse over there. But there is this big area between the two, half of which contains phenomena that are accessible to us. And it is in this area that we have to realize what's going on and get some kind of a mental picture of something we can't put into the reference system. Then we've got these two scalar dimensions, or mathematical dimensions, that we can't show in the reference system. So it's a little problem each time we come against something, getting a correct view of it. In the second volume, I had to get a grasp on matters such as the induction of charges, and that's one of the things that is very difficult to explain to somebody who wants to put everything in the reference system. We just can't visualize those things in the geometrical framework that we're used to. Okay, now he's kind of talking here about the scalar dimensions. Now, I mentioned how you can put dots on a balloon, and when you blow up the balloon, that's a scalar outward motion. Well, that is a one-dimensional scalar motion, and there are three scalar dimensions. So it basically takes three coordinate dimensions, XYZ coordinates. It takes three coordinate dimensions to represent a one-dimensional scalar motion. So those other two scalar motions, those other two dimensions of scalar motions are basically outside of this XYZ coordinate system. So they're not in the reference system. Our reference system is too limited to be able to express those two scalar dimensions, those two other scalar dimensions. And he calls them mathematical dimensions because that's really the only way that we can represent them is as magnitudes. That's kind of where the interregional ratio also comes in. We can't see those dimensions clearly, but we can come up with a value, a magnitude value for them by extrapolating more or less. And so that is something that uh, is difficult for the people who are studying the theory to kind of wrap their head around. And that's true of a lot of the reciprocal system. The main thing about learning it is kind of having to unlearn other stuff that you learned before about math and physics and so on. And that's why Larson made a mistake when he really appealed his work to the scientific community rather than maybe an intelligent eighth grader who hasn't already been indoctrinated by all the scientific propaganda out there. If they're able to see it with like a beginner's mind, they would have a much better chance. The people that are already invested in the current scientific paradigm have very little chance of grasping this theory, because every time they run into a sticking point, they just reject the theory. Oh, then the theory must be wrong. I've tried that with friends and acquaintances who, as soon as there's one thing about the theory that contradicts anything that they know, they just reject the whole theory, all at once. Oh, it doesn't agree with this, or it's like they're nitpicking to such a great extent. Especially when you're talking about this particular theory, which was derived by one guy. It's like one guy is going up against an entire army of scientists, and you're siding with the scientist, and you're saying, "Oh, these poor scientists, how we've got to support them. We have to have their back." It's like that Larson is the big bad wolf or something like that, and that's strictly only because they are invested in their own scientific education. They put too much time into it to just throw it out. And so they're ready to throw out anybody else, and all they need is the first pretext in order to do so. Obviously, Larson's not going to have all the right answers about everything. Again, he says that the theory itself is correct. Whether I have applied the theory correctly or not is a different matter. And another different matter is whether he has all the right terminology for the theory, and whether the language that he's chosen is streamlined. Much of the language that he has chosen turns out that it's pretty cumbersome. And so that means that it's more difficult to understand it. Especially using the same words that we tend to use in science. And so those are all sticking points that are kind of implicit, inherent in coming up with a whole new theory about things, but that we have to get over that. We have to be able to just kind of suspend our disbelief and just say, okay, Larson, just show me what you got. Show me how this works, and I will cut you slack. If I don't understand it, that doesn't mean that I'm rejecting it out of hand. I'm just going to put it in the back of my mind that, okay, I've got this issue, but we can keep going. I'm going to give you a fair hearing on this. And that's what I feel about Larson, is he's never been given a fair hearing by the scientific community, probably never will. Until those guys die off and we have a new generation of people that aren't particularly invested in, as the paradigm shows more and more anomalies that don't work out, gradually maybe there'll be some kind of chinks in the armor. Okay, now back to the next question. But you can represent these things mathematically. It seems to me that there must be some geometry corresponding to that, because there are all sorts of geometries other than Euclidean. Of course, you assume Euclidean geometry in one of the postulates, but if it can't represent the extra dimensions, then that postulate is not followed through. Could you make certain modifications that would not affect the deductions, but would enable you to represent those extra dimensions geometrically? Now, this is a very key point again. Larson, he had two fundamental postulates. He boiled down his theory into two fundamental postulates. And the second one assumes that that the geometry of the universe is Euclidean. And this person is pointing out that that turns out to be a limitation on your theory, because Euclidean geometry is not able to get into these second and third scalar dimensions. But there must be some other kind of geometry that does so. But Larson's answer here is, I think, problematic, and it caused him to limit this. And if he would have expanded his thinking and used a different kind of geometry, just like Sommer is saying, he would have been able to kind of, I think, bypass a lot of the things. So we're going to read his paragraph here, and then that will be it. So the problem, Larson's response, the problem is that the ordinary individual is not any better able to visualize multidimensional geometry than he is to visualize the kind of thing that I am talking about. So we go from one thing to another. That's just as bad. The problem is that we have three dimensions open to our perception. The person who's trying to understand that is trying to put it in his three dimensions of perception. And if it's something that won't fit into that, he gets the wrong idea. So, and the questioner, his first sentence here is, it just takes some getting used to, I suppose. And I think that's what Larson wasn't kind of taking into account, that people have to get used to these ideas. And so he's trying to fit it into the way that they used to think. But I think he should have been giving them credit that, okay, maybe they can adapt their thinking into this new geometry. Okay, we will leave it there. And thanks for tuning in. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.